So good morning and welcome to this webinar, which is looking about engaging with the federal government, particularly from the perspective of the Northern Territory and organisations who are based there. If anyone has any questions, if you could please pop them into the Q&A box, which I'll have open. Comments or questions, really welcome. There's a couple of you that have joined. There's more that have registered, but at the moment we only have a couple of you on the line, so perhaps we might have a few more. But myself and the Auslan interpreters, we're making up the bulk of the people attending, but that's okay. We're welcoming all. So before we get going, I'd just like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging in the lands of the country in which I'm working and talking to you from today, the land of the Ngunnawal people, and also acknowledge any other elders from lands that others are coming from today, and pay my respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be joining us today on this occasion of this workshop. So what we're going to cover today is looking at how Labor won, what's different for this election, looking at the Senate and what's next, and then looking ahead, and then how more broadly looking forward, how to engage, and in particular for Northern Territory organisations, what's the approach to engagement for you there? So how did Labor win? Well, what's really interesting is Labor's win was bigger than most people expected, even within the party. A lot of people thought that they'd scrape in with a small majority or even end up in a minority government, but that didn't happen. The campaign was very focused and was very disciplined. It stuck to the issues that mattered most to people. And as a consequence, it was, clear cut. It was talking to about the issues that people were concerned about. They wanted solutions for. And conversely, the coalition, if you looked at sort of breaking down what they were talking about, they were really talking about taking things away from people. So removing the right of people to work from home, more public servants, and looking at making people redundant, etc., etc. So there wasn't a huge amount of positivity, positivity in terms of the agenda that the coalition was putting forward. So I think the foil between the two was one of the key points that led to Labor's victory. So I'm just sorry. So what's different with this election? Obviously, there's a number of firsts here. The first time in history, the Labor left faction has more seats in the caucus than the right. And the Labor Party has been around for over 150 years, I think it is. So that's quite a historical development. Historically, it's also the largest Labor grouping ever in the House of Representatives. And the other thing is that Labor's left has more people in cabinet than the right as well for the first time. At the same time, we're looking at the smallest coalition in years, coalition representatives in the parliament, and the worst result in over 70 years. And as we can see, we know that the coalition hasn't been unified in the last few months. And I think there's a question there, probably from the electorate's point of view, about what the electorate perhaps perceives as the opposition and whether it's really as effective as it may have been in the past, or certainly the coalition in the current role as the opposition. It's obviously a little bit more complicated than that, even though Labor did win 94 seats in the House, and it's a very big numbers on paper. It is the first time that in history that more people voted for another party other than the main parties. It's the biggest figure there. the people voting for someone other than the main two or main three parties, if you like, the Coalition and Labor. And that looks set to not stop in the future. It seems like it's a trend that is continuing to develop and grow. So whilst on paper it's a very big win, it's not so much of a landslide victory for Labor as perhaps people rejecting what the coalition was offering. And so it does have an increased mandate. It's going to be careful how it uses that or how it ensuring that it doesn't have sort of move forward with hubris and arrogance. Obviously, no government wants to be accused of that, but I think it's important to note that. So in the Senate, the government can still secure support from the coalition, or needs to pass legislation through the Senate. And obviously, for those of you who aren't aware, most legislation in Parliament is actually passed by the sort of support of both of the major groups. Now, I'm not sure whether that's going to happen in this Parliament, but a lot of legislation goes through relatively uncontroversially, and it's sort of 10 to 15% of legislation which has become, we become aware of because it's covered extensively in by journalists and the media. But that's interesting nonetheless. So it effectively leaves the government with two viable pathways in the Senate to pass legislation, securing support from the coalition or negotiating with the Greens. Now, One Nation now has 4 senators, the same number as the Nationals. Obviously, there's one less Green senator now, with Dorinda Cox having moved to the Labor benches. And that means that the coalition and Greens previously in the last Parliament were able to block legislation in the Senate. They don't have the ability to do that now with Dorinda Cox having moved. Now, that's not to say that other members of the crossbench may not, cobble together with the coalition and Greens to do that. It's possible, but it becomes it becomes more messy to be able to block legislation like they did in the last Parliament. Not as easy. So what's next? The coalition has officially reunited after Liberal leader Susan Lee and Nationals leader David Littleproud reached a formal agreement, what's called a coalition agreement. One of the sticking points, obviously, was the issue of solidarity or cabinet solidarity. David Littleproud was seeking, off his own bat, he didn't take this to the National Party room, but he was seeking off his own bat for the Nationals to be able to vote against things in the chamber if they wanted to. That was something that Susan Lee rejected. And so when it went back to the Nationals, they then moved on that, and the Liberals moved on a couple of other things and policy issues, and so they came to an agreement. Whether or not that's going to undermine David Littleproud's leadership in the coming weeks and months, yet to be seen. But there's some question, I think, about whether or not he's lost some support over that move to do that. There was uncertainty, I think, was something that worked in Labor's favour during the election, obviously, in terms of some of the issues and some of the headwinds that were coming at Australia from internationally. Now the key challenge is to deliver on the agenda that they took to the election. You'll note that the Prime Minister is poised to meet President Trump tomorrow in Calgary in Canada at the G7 summit on the sidelines, and he's meeting, I think, 8 in total, including President Trump, 8 world leaders there. But whether or not it's easier said than done when you're in an election, uncertainty can play into your favour, as I think it did for Labor. We now know that the United States is probably quite distracted. President Trump's got a lot of things on his agenda, not least of which is a number of world conflicts in Ukraine and between Ukraine and Russia, in the Gaza, the Palestinian Israeli conflict, and now the Iranian-Israeli conflict and the potential for the US to get involved there. And so whether or not Prime Minister Albanese is going to be able to emerge from that sideline discussion with a resolution to, or even progress on the tariff issue, we will wait to see. We'll have news of that tomorrow. I think it's going to be early hours of the morning, our time, 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. here. So when we wake up in the morning, if we're as boring as me, we'll be getting news about that. One of the things that Labor is trying to do is looking at productivity. One of the ways you can improve the budget bottom line is obviously to increase productivity of companies and therefore their profit margins. So Labor is looking at that. Treasurer Jim Chalmers has flagged that as a priority. So if that's something that you can canvass when you are meeting with people in terms of any productivity related issues, or if you've got a fee-for-service arrangement with government, please think about that in the context. Don't rule it out. It doesn't have to necessarily be coming from a commercial corporate point of view. It could be coming from a point of view of something that you are delivering on and making a program, for example, that you might be delivering more productive in terms of that fee-for-service relationship. So have a think about it in those terms. So what's the outlook for where we're at now? Obviously, after this result, and I would say that nothing can be assured or guaranteed. I'm a former federal Labor advisor to the Rudd Gillard and Beazley times in Parliament, and I also worked for the British Labor Party, and so people can probably guess where I may have been aligning myself. But what obviously we were looking at potentially a coalition victory as late as February this year. The polls were pointing to the potential for certainly minority coalition government, if not perhaps even better than that. Now the polls took this extraordinary about turn, and YouGov, who is one of the leading polling research agencies in Australia, said when we did a number of webinars with them, was that they'd never seen such a change in the polls in such a short period of time as we have done in Australia between February and May this year in polling history. Now, why was that? I think it was for a whole lot of reasons. Liberation Day in the US, the uncertainty that President Trump and perhaps some of the decisions that he was making were playing how they were playing out. The view from people that a Dutton government may bring alignment to the United States on some of these issues. And I read just recently, I think just a day or two ago, that there was some research that Australians are the second most opposed to the US or to President Trump and his agenda in the world after Norway. So that's interesting. I had not seen that data, that information before. I think it was some sort of academic study or something. But if that is the case, it makes a lot of sense that people were concerned about the potential for a Dutton government to perhaps align itself with the Trump administration, both politically, perhaps not stand up for Australia in certain things like tariffs post Liberation Day and the chaos that may have caused on world markets. And those sorts of decisions are continuing to have, we're seeing the impact on petrol prices and crude oil, which is going up today in the context of Iran and Israel's conflict, and just the impact of being able to get oil out of that region in the context of a regional conflict. So, I think based on all of that, people made a decision to, I suppose, go with stability, go with something that they knew, a government that was doing okay by them. It wasn't a disaster for them. There was some possibility that the things were going to improve. There'd been one or two interest rate cuts, or one had happened, one was on the horizon, and a number of others were predicted. So, I think on the basis of that, people did what they did at the election. Obviously, much will depend on domestic performance and perception and behaviour of the Labor government. And obviously, what happens with those international headwinds. Now, you're a better person than me if you can predict exactly what's happening with those international headwinds. I think we can just probably know that they're going to be choppy. In which direction they're going to be blowing, I think it's anyone's guess. I think they'll be blowing in lots of directions, to use that analogy. In continually, the Bureau of Meteorology is really going to have a difficult time predicting the direction of the international headwinds, but nonetheless, I think if you remove perhaps Australia's being able to have a great deal of success with that, but perhaps just putting forward Australia's position and standing up for Australia, which is what the Prime Minister and people like Penny Wong and Richard Marles has been doing. I think obviously people are going to be probably making some decisions on the domestic performance and perception of the Labor government. They need to be able to deliver on the things that they promised. Paul Erickson, the party secretary, the National Party secretary, spoke recently at the National Press Club. And if you are interested, then please jump on to YouTube and have a look at the National Press Club's account and look at his speech, where he really talked in detail about the campaign, but also about how he saw the future and what Labor should be doing. And again, he was positioning that, he was suggesting that they really should be, doing what they said they do. So it will be really interesting to see what happens domestically. I think the big question is the government going to be cautious or is it going to be bold? I was at a conference last week in Old Parliament House in Canberra, the Australian Progress Conference, and it was the big issue of the conference over 2 days. Is the government going to be cautious or is it going to be bold? I would probably, after that discussion, last time I did this webinar was a week and a bit ago. After that discussion, and after listening and sort of reflecting on a lot of things that people were saying, and I was on a panel there, I actually think that they can probably be both. And I think that, and I know that sounds like you thinking, has Joe had enough coffee this morning? I probably haven't, but I think you could be both cautious in the sense of doing what you said you were going to do. And as Paul Erickson said, sort of people want and voted for what it said on the label. So do that first. And I think they'll use MyEFO to do that, or they'll at least put some really major sort of they'll throw some really major money, or they'll reorganize some of the budget spending to reflect some of the commitments that they made in the election. But I then think that after that, and I think we can probably inspire and control and convince them to be a little bit bolder. And if you listen to some of the words of the Prime Minister, and again, it's one of the discussions that we had last week at the conference. I'm not sure whether any of you were there, but one of the things that I think that we've seen the Prime Minister talk about just in the last week was, for example, they're bringing together a industry discussion, business and the unions together, having a meeting in the cabinet room in the weeks and months to come. I think it's next month, ahead of Parliament sitting for the first time at the end of July. They're doing a few other things, and I think that there is a couple of things couple of signs. There's a few staffing appointments that I'm aware of that I don't think have become public quite yet, but that sort of signal that there may be a little bit more ambition and a preparedness to do that. but I think they want to deliver on what they committed to at the election. So I think they need to do that first, and then they need to do the other stuff after that, obviously, or alongside of that. So I think when you are speaking with government federally, obviously think about the ways in which you might be able to talk to some of the things that they have committed to in the election, alongside anything that perhaps might take them beyond that. See whether or not you can couple them together. How can government do what they said they do and then link to that? If there's a step or two or three or four beyond that in terms of some of the spaces that you're working in, how can they do that? So how do we engage with a government now they've been re-elected with a bigger mandate? Again, I wanted to just remind people, if you wanted to put any questions or comments, put them in the Q&A box, which I've got open here. And if anyone wants to say anything, happy to weave that into what I'm saying. I'm always very happy to weave in comments and questions as I go. So based on the results, fair to say that it would serve your organisation well if you focus on developing, long-term trusted and considered relationships with advisors and ministers and backbenchers. Now, I can't read a crystal ball. I don't have one, but I wish I did. But I dare say that there's a very strong likelihood, based on the numbers in Parliament, that Labor will be re-elected for a third term at the next election, and possibly, and you can all laugh, and please put some laughing emojis in the chat, even maybe a fourth term, depending on how that next election goes. And for example, one of the things we talked about at the Progress conference last week was, there may be a transition to Jim Chalmers, for example, perhaps before the next election. And if that happens, it's an opportunity for renewal and for a new leader to take forward a new period of government. Let's see. That would make Labor be in government for 12 years, which isn't unheard of. But I dare say we're definitely looking at 3 terms. If that's the case, what do we do with that? I think we need to be able to say that, yes, there may be some short-term immediate things. I'm dealing with some clients who've got some issues, very, 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 very immediate about funding. And they're really big issues that are being prosecuted. But at the same time, beyond that, what is it that we can talk about in the medium to long term? What is it that we can talk about in terms of, when we are working with them about their agenda? Talk to them about what are they thinking about? What are they wanting to do with you? How could you work together with them on some of those things? Ask them what they're thinking. Now, they're not going to tell you their planned agenda over the next 6 years. You can probably guess some of it, but it's up to you to have those conversations with advisors and members of Parliament and ministers. So how do we engage in sort of in reality, day to day? And these are some, I suppose, set of ideas and tips and suggestions on tactics in terms of going forward. Now, staffing changes obviously are underway. There is, excuse me, still a lot of staff yet to be confirmed. I don't know, that's sort of now 6 weeks on. But it is, nonetheless, there are some sort of bedding down of some of the staffing arrangements. I don't think the full details of the coalition and crossbench staffing have fully been put into reality. So I think that's yet to be confirmed. But I think one of the things that's really important is, obviously recognize where your last conversation left off. but don't assume that you're picking up exactly where you did leave it. Because I think if you did that, you're sort of doing yourself a disservice. Because before the election, there was a little bit more concern, a bit more caution, a bit of a concern that they'd be in a minority parliament. And so I think you've got to, I'm not saying you sort of start again from scratch, but I do think it's important to go ask them where they think things are up to. I was speaking to someone last week who indicated that there was a tightening on spending around MyEFO, and that there may not be any new policies or new programs carved out from that. It's an opportunity to illustrate and to demonstrate to the electorate how they're going to sort of put some substance around the bones of what was promised at the election. So, we yet to see that, but I think that's something that if you were expecting perhaps some money to be made available to you in MyEFO, that may or may not happen. So these are something that you can talk to people about when you are, canvassing these options with people when you're talking. Obviously, I think it's important to watch for shifting portfolio priorities. One of the things that we have noticed in recent weeks is some of the ministers, when they've come to make their first sort of comments or speeches post-election, there's been some subtle shifts of language, perhaps more adventurous, more nuanced. It's always nuanced, but more adventurous, perhaps taking a different directions subtly, or even not so subtly. And so really examine any statements that the ministers that you're dealing with have made. I think that's really important to do. Have a look at their speeches, look at their press releases. Speeches are particularly interesting because it's an opportunity for them to go a little bit broader in terms of their commentaries. Have a really look at that, and have a look also for any comments that they may have made to the media where they may have gone again, perhaps in a slightly different direction. I think it's really important to have a look at that. So what else can we be thinking about now with this new government? Frame your agenda in terms of their agenda. I'm not saying you limit it to that. You don't do that, but you start with, as I said, I think one of the things that they're going to want to do is honour the commitments they made at the election, that they talk to the electorate. So if you can align anything that you're talking about to those priorities, then that's a good starting point. There's obviously going to be gaps in policy or silence on issues, and that always is the case. And so, use that as an opening to propose new ideas and solutions. But make sure that you're bandwidth aware. At the moment, there's a lot going on for government. If you're dealing with any of the senior ministers, there's a lot happening. There's a lot going on the international stage. There's a lot for them to be thinking about. And so be cognizant of their operating environment when you go and seek to engage with them. Obviously, thinking about engaging strategically, start with advisors. I always recommend that. As a former advisor, I think advisors are often freer to speak more openly, a little bit more honest, and use those meetings to build momentum in terms of where you go. Complement those political engagement opportunities with departmental briefings or meetings where relevant or where possible. You may have already some really good points of reference in departments, and so make sure that you use those. Now, they may or may not be very open or completely, as typically with departments, they're not going to be telling you exactly what's on their mind. but they will be happy to hear from you and to discuss things within their permission sort of abilities to be able to speak to you. And so I think that's a good thing to do. Thinking about backbench opportunities is something that I talked to the conference last week about. There's 94 Labor MPs in the House of Representatives, and there's obviously a whole bunch of senators, Labor senators. You know, there's 64 Labor backbenchers in the House. That's a lot of people. That's double the amount of people, more than double what's in the ministry. There's many who don't have any knowledge about what you're saying or what you're selling. So introduce yourself to them, try and help them form their opinions and educate them about what it is you are saying and what it is you're saying the issues are and what needs to be addressed. You know, there's going to be a lot of opportunities to engage with these backbenchers, and please use all the opportunities there are. So that includes committees, it includes inquiries, it includes backbench meetings, meeting with them locally, meeting with them online, going to Canberra, all of the things, parliamentary friends groups. Many of those are going to be reformed with new conveners, but it won't take long for those to get back up and running. There's members of all of those committees, those friends groups. They won't give you the membership of that, but you can, if you go to any of their events or help perhaps invite them to participate in an event, you can glean who are perhaps people who are interested in your issues. The other way of doing that is obviously to do a search through Hansard about about MPs and people who may have spoken about you or your organisation or your issues. That's another way of trying to build that intelligence. So building internal advocacy and timing your engagement is really important. I'm not saying that the crossbench or the opposition have no role in this particular parliament. They obviously do. They always do. One of the things that people were talking about last week was, you know, how strong the opposition is going to be. Is the crossbench perhaps going to become the new opposition? I would dare say or dare offer that with education, there could be a really effective group within the government, within the government's backbench MPs that can lead discussions. I'm not saying visible opposition, but discussions within the Labor caucus to create some discussion and perhaps change the agenda, I think. And I would explore that. And I would explore making sure that you've made everyone aware of your issues before you necessarily go to the opposition to sort of start having arguments for argument's sake. Give Labor and the government time, may not be a lot of time, but depending on what your issue is, if it's critical, then obviously it may be, you know, fairly time critical. If it's something that's not as time critical, it could be a couple of months or 6 months. But give Labor and the government an opportunity to say no, they're not interested, they're not going to do that before you do anything more broadly. I'm not saying you don't do that very soon, you might do that sooner than later, but give them an opportunity to really press the Labor side very, very much, a lot before you do that. Obviously, engaging Labor-wide is really important, and you know there is things like the social media feeds, for example, of Labor backbenchers. You know, there's all sorts of people that you may be able to engender some support from. Some of the things coming up, there's MyEFO, there's the federal budget next year. There's all of those things to start planning for. The sitting and non-sitting weeks. First sitting week is at the end of July. And there's obviously an opportunity to plan events and to create buzz to attract MPs and advisors to come around and listen to you as well. So in terms of the Northern Territory and approaching engagement from the perspective of being a Northern Territory organisation, obviously you need to understand the landscape. There's a recent change to the government in the Northern Territory that you need to be aware of, and I'm sure you are. There's been, issues around the police commissioner, which has dominated media and has impacted on the government's focus. And being aware of all of those, they will influence the priorities and sensitivities of the government itself. Obviously, the CLP will probably prioritise things perhaps other than you are asking them to. And how do you deal with that? I think one of the things that you could probably do is seek the advice of perhaps some of the federal Labor MPs and seek their advice about what they would say. You don't necessarily want them to go, you don't want to create a fight if there was no need to have one. But it is a more difficult thing to navigate than if you have it in a state where you have a Labor state government and a Labor federal government. There's obviously, you can engage regional and Indigenous leaders within the Territory, and it's obviously the Territory itself deeply connected to regional communities and Indigenous organisations, groups, community-controlled organisations and country. So building strong relationships with those stakeholders can obviously create a grassroots support and credibility as well. I'm sure you already may be doing some of those things already. Using local advocates as bridges. Many Northern Territory MPs represent regional or remote electorates, so localising your engagement can really offer an opportunity to for them to sort of stand up and take notice, using community forums or pilot projects, perhaps, or asking for that to happen is obviously something that you can consider as well. And tailoring your messaging for different governments. So the messaging that you use federally with, say, when you're talking to Labor may be different to the one when you are communicating with the Northern Territory government, I would dare say. It's really important to have a think about how you might be communicating. And seeing whether there is an opportunity to work together. The federal government needs to work with all states and territories, including the Northern Territory government. So where is there an opportunity, perhaps, to look at joint funding? I think that's something that people need to think about. There's obviously possibility of government-led forums, joining advisory committees in the Territory, task forces, industry working groups in the Territory. See whether or not that's something that you can do to try and increase and enhance your voice and leverage your positioning and your voice. I think it's important to leverage where you're standing. You've got to be truthful to yourself and your organisation, but at the same time, you've got to be respectful and keep communications open. Goes without saying, really. Sort of being rude or abusive to someone in a meeting doesn't necessarily help. Sometimes you've got to be honest and straightforward, but there's a fine line, obviously, sometimes. Using practical language, trying to avoid, use territory relevant, terms and language, avoiding abstract language, jobs for locals, training for young people, housing for families, etc. I think that goes without saying. It's probably helpful right around the country, to be honest, using straightforward language. And referencing Northern Territory specific priorities, framing your proposal to align with regional growth areas like Alice Springs, Katherine, etc., etc. There may be, do have a focus on youth justice and community safety and infrastructure gaps. So is there anything that you're doing that you can perhaps have an honest and open discussion with them? And it may be problematic and challenging, but it's something you need to probably think about and apply yourself to. So this is sort of we're drawing to the end of the webinar. If anyone's got any questions or comments, please pop them into the chat, the Q&A box. But we're just drawing to a close. We will be having, this recording will be available on our YouTube channel. And we will have some webinars in the coming weeks and months, more specifically about media that you can use, new media and how it's playing into campaigning and communications in the purpose and impact space. And we always have lots of webinars each and every month. So keep an eye out for those. But thank you again for joining us today. I'm really grateful to have your company, and I hope you have a great day. And thanks again for joining us.